It's actually Salon 42 now.
No, I'm pretty sure we did 42, didn't we?
No, I
I mean,
think
you
we did.
keep track, so I could be wrong. It could
I
be
think we did
42.
41, and then it was like, okay, the next one is 42, so we better know what we're doing.
Is that
Um,
can we is that for the title right there?
It's time for the Access of Easy podcast.
Yeah, quick with the trigger because the so many times we've had amazing conversations before recording and after recording. I kind of feel our policy should be that as soon as we connect, the show starts and it goes until we disconnect because otherwise there's just gold that is, really should be handled. So, Charles,
much of it comedic.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Charles, what would you like to talk about today?
Well, I'd like to talk about your essay on is system change likely or possible or inevitable?
Right on. Mark?
Well, I sent out that email on my topics, and I realized that the one big thing I've been sort of following this month that I didn't put in that email was central bank digital currencies are kind of coming to the fore now. And a lot of my predictions around those are coming to pass, like expiry dates on digital cash and things like that.
Well, and we, in that email thread, you sort of brought up the Facebook currency and how Facebook has this like zombie currency that everybody thinks is dead, but in fact is more like the undead because it will never die, insofar Facebook isn't going to die. And my essay on inevitable systems change was also tied to this idea that governments are developing a diplomatic corps just to deal with digital platforms. That they are having, whether it's the State Department in the United States or, whether it's the Foreign Service in Britain, they're developing expertise to negotiate directly with the technology giants, which fits our kind of network state metaphor. And it made me kind of wonder if a diplomatic corps is a necessary prerequisite to interstate negotiations. And again, it feels like it's getting into the cyberpunk world that we often argue is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. But on a selfish level, I kind of want to talk to you guys about inflation, only because it feels as if society is now acknowledging that we're in an inflationary period. And so I'm curious to kind of explore what that means and what the consequences are.
I sent out that Grant Williams newsletter because he spends the whole 22 pages exploring that inflation versus deflation dynamic. I think it's called Amen Corner was the title of this month's edition. And there are still people who are deflationists out of all this, people who are super intelligent people like Lacey Hunt and Russell Napier is flipped to inflation. But I started to understand the difference between I started to understand the difference between why the deflationists say that the stimulus that's happened up until now was not inflationary. But now that we're going into a fiscal stimulus regime, that is more inflationary. But I mean, again, even Grant Williams in that thing was saying, to Charles's point, we could have this deflationary shock or implosion that sort of sucks all the water out of the beach, and then people are standing around going, oh, look at all the pretty shells, before the inflationary thing comes in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're interested in this topic, Jesse, because it's one of those knotty problems for which there is no easy answer, although everybody wants an easy answer because we're still running wetware 1.0, right? We want an easy answer. So to kind of just expand on what Mark said about deflation and inflation, we can start by looking at what causes inflation. Okay, so we know that all the lumber mills shut down in the pandemic, right? Because demand for building supplies dropped. And so then they started back up. And then because of this surge of people moving and deciding they wanted to change their lives, and there's this massive spike in demand for building materials. And suddenly they don't have enough workers. They don't have enough capacity. And so a sheet of plywood that cost $25 in the US now costs $85 or $95, depending. And so it's like, well, that's going to kill a lot of building projects. So you get supply constraints, right? That's or shortages, right? From drought, floods, geopolitical, the Suez Canal being blocked. I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts in that. But I think what's underestimated there is the dependence on really long, fragile, just-in-time global supply chains. In other words, we only manage what we measure, and we only optimize what we measure, right? And so the incentives in globalization are cut out everything, strip it to the bone, baby. There's no duplicate factory for semiconductor liquids, that you have to use to clean the plates, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, one supplier's fine because we can't afford any duplication, right? And so there's no redundancy. And so this is what you get. Once the supply chains start breaking down, they've been optimized to such a level of perfection, there's no way to get it back up. And, you go, how could semiconductors be in shortage? Are you freaking kidding me? Yeah, okay, we know it costs $2 to $3 billion to build a fab. But it's like all the suppliers of the equipment, right? They've been around. It's like not like they didn't go out of business, but it takes a long time to build a fab.
And I think you hit it right in the nose, Charles, that it's the consequences of the supply chain logic, the on-demand supply. Because certainly in the lumber area, it's because there's literally no warehouses. Right? They used to have stores. They used to have capacities. Those are gone, right? They priced those out of the market. And the semiconductor piece is similarly interesting because part of the logic there is planned obsolescence, right? The reason the auto industry is so screwed is they use old semiconductors that the industry does not want to manufacture right now because demand for the new ones is so high that's where they're making their margin. They're not going to make a lot of money building the old stuff with limited demand. So that means the auto industry either has to scrap its designs or use far more expensive technology, which increases the price of automobiles. So all of this is the cascading failure of the logic that went into the previous system of globalization. It's been disrupted. Now it's being reconfigured. And that's where I think it's interesting either to speculate or prepare for the consequences of how this plays out, which I want to come back to in the end, why Taiwan is so essential, so strategic to the production of these semiconductor chips, because that is why the geopolitical conflict of China versus America becomes, really high stakes.
Very good point. They're the foundry, and of course, I actually had a friend who had a semiconductor software, the kind of embedded software for power management. That was his company 20 years ago. So I ended up having to learn a little bit about the semiconductor industry. And yeah, the dominoes have to fall a very specific way to get the semiconductor built. And of course, as you say, there's lots of chips that are like $1, 50 cents, $2. They're the chips that are in your washing machine and dryer motherboard, and so the auto industry uses a lot of that low tech kind of chips, right? And but of course, if you're going to go buy that motherboard, it's $250. I know for a fact the semiconductor chips in that device are worth maybe $12 to $15 total. And the circuit board is $5. But there you go. That's the other part of the supply chain. You want a motherboard for your Sears dryer model 7315? Oh, well, that's going to cost you $250 because guess what? There are no alternative sources. No one in Mexico is going to make that. There's just not enough demand. It's not worth it. So you're going to pay what we ask. And that's another source of inflation, right? That comes with no redundancy, limited supplies, et cetera. So, but
now
let's also talk. Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, it strikes me, Mark, we're talking about supply chain in terms of its brittleness, both to disruption and pricing influences. But you've been talking about the hacking of software supply chains, which has its own kind of implications. Do you want to bring that in?
Yeah, great idea.
The whole thing. I was just thinking while you guys were talking about that. I'm going to get to the supply chain thing in a sec. I normally don't. Over the course of my life, I didn't concern myself too much with geopolitical conflicts because I was a bit of an anarchist and I just, had that whole philosophy about things. But what I see going on today with China really does frighten me because I think they're playing a game of 3D chess and the West is playing, some combination of woke checkers. Right. And we're just kind of like hugging trees and eating granola and feeling stuff. And China is just ready to just say, come meet the new boss. Right. And I started thinking about that because of what I see happening with Taiwan. China is flying more sorties with larger planes toward China every day. And there was a Dmitry Kafina's Hidden Forces episode with a Sino geopolitical area experts saying, we don't know when they're going to do it, just someday they're going to do it. And one of the ways they're going to preamble it, maybe over the course of years, is they're just going to fly larger and larger sorties of planes over China until one day those planes just start dropping a bunch of bombs or just start an invasion, because they're going to try and inculcate Taiwan into like, oh, here they come again, here they come again, here they come again. And then one day it's going to be game on. And sometimes I think that day is going to be sooner than later. And that does tie into the supply chain hack. I know the solar winds was attributed to Russia, and that whole chain of attribution makes me a little crazy because I sort of watched it unfold in real time from a single sentence article in Reuters that suddenly everybody was pointing at that article and then pointing at other articles that pointed at that article. It was like a Mobius strip of attribution that I just thought, okay, is this really, it just seems, I don't worry about Russia. I worry about China and all of these supply chain hacks. A friend of mine says, World War III has already started. Just nobody has told anybody. Nobody has told the people yet that this is happening. And World War III is being fought with very different weapons than World Wars I and II, which could possibly be a very good thing because there's a lot less bloodshed involved. But these supply chain hacks I get torn between thinking these are just normal hackers doing it for lols, and these are very sophisticated nation state attacks, because what's coming out of some of these supply chain attacks is how shitty the security is at some of these companies.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about China for a second. A friend of mine on the East Coast of the U.S. Had me join a conversation from a true sinology, a China expert, like a guy that spoke and read Mandarin and was an expert on the Chinese military public documents. And so this guy was giving a lecture to kind of a, highly educated audience about the Chinese military's view of Sun Tzu, right? The famed art of war. And he said, the art of war is well studied in American military academies as well, right? And the Chinese military uses a lot of the U.S. Military features of the Afghan war and the Iraqi war as examples of Sun Tzu, right? In other words, everybody thinks the U.S. is some sort of, bloated, impossibly behind the times, and it's all like, well, actually, that's a nice exaggeration, but it's not really the case. That the Chinese are very aware of the fact the U.S. has tremendous capacity militarily still, and so. But let's talk about China in another way. What struck me, and I didn't make any comments But I'm fairly familiar with China, and what struck me was how little all these well-educated middle-class Americans knew about China. Even the guys that were in the military-industrial complex, they worked for defense contractors, and it was all like, wow, these guys don't know jack. I mean, they really don't. And so it's all like, okay, well, that's a big gap. I mean, I would suspect that the State Department and the Pentagon probably have the best handle on China, not just as a threat, but as a culture, because you've really got to understand their history to make an assessment of all that stuff. So, but I want to throw out an idea here. China is now rich enough that it can establish its own parallel system, right? In its entirety. In other words, an entire socio-economic political system that runs parallel to the West, interacts with the West, but is no longer dependent on the West. So you have a surveillance, quasi-socialist economy and political structure, a very strong centralized hierarchy, and you've got supply chains and road and belt and all this stuff. And so it's all like, well, that's exactly what every country should do, right? Why be dependent on some other nation state, right? You want to be independent. And so it's like, well, so we're supposed to deny them that? Like, oh, that's bad, that's wrong to get out from underneath the thumb of the United States? I mean, so competition is what's happening. And I think that's actually good. Now, I'm not saying that China attacking Taiwan is a good thing. No, it's not. If they want to win Taiwan, they have to win the hearts and minds. But I think that China's existential threat to the West is actually a positive thing, because the West better get off its hands and start creating a more open, more productive, alternative to the Chinese system, right? And one last point I want to speak to is this idea of the nation state and network state. Well, China is making no bones about taking down Jack Ma and the Ant Group. There's just like, there's no network state that's going to compete with us. Now, to Jesse's point in previous shows, maybe China will become the first network state, but they're not allowing any private sector competition to be the network state. I think that's pretty clear.
So, where I'll push back there is, the Chinese Communist Party likes to project prowess, likes to project control, likes to project dominance. But with all due respect, that's all that they are, is projections. There are network states who will challenge the Chinese government, but to your point, they may not be the domestic ones. Because the domestic ones are ones that the Chinese government is still in a position to neutralize and control. And we don't yet know what's happened to Jack Ma. That's the other problem with, those of us on the outside, is that the Chinese government certainly is a kind of black box. For all we know, Jack Ma and his fledgling network state may have pledged allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party and is working closely with them to ensure that the capabilities developed by Blue Ant Financial and the ambitions of Jack Ma are aligned with the Chinese Politburo proper. Whether coercion played a big part in that is perhaps a given, but we don't know, is the point. And that is, yes, why I hypothesized not that China would be the first network state, but that China would be the first nation state to evolve into a network state. Precisely out of a desire to maintain power, precisely out of a desire to grow as an empire, to reach the kind of ambitions that we know Xi Jinping and many other leaders have. But with that said, I think that they're vulnerable. I think that all these governments are vulnerable, in part because the internet is accelerating society. There's a velocity to the internet that very few nation states are able to operate on, that even network states like Facebook and Amazon have difficulty with. But I've been toying with the idea, what if Amazon could be transformed into a distributed cooperative, right? If Amazon is just this big machine that's being optimized by its owners to not only produce a more effective cloud computing, a more effective warehouse, a more effective logistics system, why couldn't someone else take control of that computer? Whether it's a nation state or, whether it's outside forces. And by outside forces, let me be clear. I do not necessarily believe in a socialist conspiracy, although if there is one, please let me sign up. No, I mean more a cryptocurrency, right? Like, I think to go to Mark's point about World War III, and, Marshall McLuhan declared that war in the 60s, right? Marshall McLuhan in the 60s said that the information war is here. It is total, it is perpetual, and it is without end. And he's right, and it's the stakes are growing higher and higher. To Mark's point, because the cybersecurity practices of many industries and governments are shit, and they're being exposed for it. But the moral of it all, really, fundamentally, when you think about it, is vulnerability. The vulnerability of the nation state, the vulnerability in this case of the network state, and the ease by which it is to infiltrate and to sabotage and to mess. And I'm not saying that because I like it. I'm saying that because it reflects the state of insecurity we're in. So to Mark's point, a coup d'etat in our contemporary terms is not based on guns. It's not based on seizing the post office and seizing the telephone office. I would argue that a coup d'etat is waged using cryptocurrency. Now, I'd say about 9 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I mined Doge. And I mined quite a bit of Doge. And on somewhere that Doge sits on a hard drive, I know where not. Do I regret that I no longer have that Doge? No, I don't regret because I don't have that Doge, because I don't want to be part of the Doge revolution. Hey, the climb revolution, sign me up anytime. The Doge revolution I knew was coming. That's why I mined that Doge. But as a non-believer, I did not bother to maintain that wallet in any way that allowed me to redeem it today. And what does that say about the role of cryptocurrency in the future? That only the zealots will have their money to use, and the rest of us, we just can't remember it for the life of us.
That's
okay,
funny.
Mark, take it away.
Yeah. I was going to say, to Charles's point, I don't begrudge China from wanting to get out under Western hegemony. I don't begrudge anyone from wanting to get out and do it on their own. Where I get, because it's a shift that has been playing out for a long time, and people like Catherine Austin Fitts were the first to sort of draw my attention to it, that we're shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, right? For a while, it seemed like there were no challengers to the US, and now there are. And I think that's just the way of the world. If that dynamic can play out, if that shift can happen without what's called, as per the book, the Thucydides trap, without the challenging power and the descending power or the waning power getting into a global conflict because the stakes are so much higher, that would be a good thing. And the book by that name, I think, said that in the last 2,000 years, when that dynamic has played out 18 times, I think 12 of them resulted in a war, 6 of them resulted in avoiding a war. So nothing's baked in stone. What worries me about the ascent of China, if China was just a culturally unique society pursuing their own agenda and rivaling or breaking away from the power of the West or the US, so be it, fair point, whatever. But it's that state-dominated authoritarianism. It's that technocracy, totalitarian regime with no civil liberties that doesn't threaten the West directly militarily. I'm not worried about waking up one day and there's PLA boots on the ground outside. I'm worried that all of our politicians here love the Chinese model and they want to implement China-style social credit and China-style capitalism with communist attributions or characteristics or whatever that phrase is here. I just find this adoration of the Chinese way of doing things. I see even, blue check Twitter and media pundits and stuff like this sort of looking at, well, if China can do it, why aren't we doing it? It's like, because we're not a totalitarian dictatorship. That's why we're not doing it. And for the Ant Group, I mean, that's horrific what happened there. That on the eve of an IPO, the CEO gives a speech that's critical of the CCP. All of a sudden, he disappears for a month. IPO is canceled. Now they're restructuring. They're being turned into a bank holding company underneath direct supervision of the Chinese central bank. Like, I mean, it's almost the opposite extreme in China. Here in North America, we bitch and moan about the company store and Amazon and how they screw everyone but themselves, and how Microsoft and Google and Facebook are kind of problematic in their own right. And so here, when representatives like Wyden down in the States, who's actually making some interesting maneuvers against big tech, it's sort of like they can be justified, or at least they're not as vividly nightmarish as the Chinese ones. It's this interesting dynamic that big tech seems to be victimized in China, and they're the victimizers here in the West. And it's just the role of the government. I guess it's some sort of spectrum. Like, maybe here in the West, governments are trying to make something sensible out of it, and in the West, in China, they're really trying not to lose power. But at the end of the day, I think that's what every government wants. So what I fear is creeping China-style authoritarianism throughout the entire world. And that's why I hope that a lot of these decentralized protocols and decentralized network states make this clean break, or this they get that critical mass, so that these governments can be throwing these laws around or making these pronouncements, and it really doesn't matter in the real world. Like, Charles may not have been paying attention to it, but Stephen Guilbeault, Canada's heritage minister, I mean, what he's planning on coming out with in a couple of weeks for the internet censorship bill, time will tell when we see it, but the hints he's been dropping in the media, I mean, he seems to be like watching China and saying, yeah, this is going to work. I don't know if Jesse's frozen up completely, or
no, Charles.
Oh, all right. Well, I think you're quite right, Mark, that authoritarianism and centralized authoritarianism is the enemy of personal liberty, right? And so I think we all are concerned about China's model being most attractive to other central states in one form or another. But China has its own challenges and vulnerabilities, to use Jesse's very appropriate word. One of them is, of course, demographic. They have a huge baby boom, which is retiring. They have a much smaller workforce behind it. And so they have the same problem as all the other developed countries. And their policy is less a result of development. It's also the one child policy on top of development. But so that's an issue you don't overcome by fancy footwork, right? You just don't have the workforce to generate the productivity and wealth to fund the retirement for 600 million people. So, and then they also have energy. So when I first went to China in 2000, I went to Shanghai and Suzhou and Hangzhou. There were no cars to speak of, except a few official cars, and then the Germans had handily gained a monopoly on the taxi business in China. So there was some Volkswagen Santanas everywhere, and then bicycles. And so now what's happened is there's 5 ring roads filled with traffic jams, right? So now China's made the mistake, really, a strategic mistake, of a fatal mistake, which was total dependency on hydrocarbons. They are just as dependent as anybody else. Yeah, I know they're building windmills and blah blah blah, but we have friends who are in the windmill industry in China, and it's just like here or anywhere else. It's like 2% of their power consumption, right? You can build 1,000 windmills a month, and you're up to 2.5%. It's a joke, right? There's no way you're going to replace
The
hydrocarbons.
reactors too.
Yeah, but you have to build one a week for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
It's like, so there's only 85 million barrels of oil available right now. I don't care how many wells you pump, where you search, dig the Arctic, whatever. All you're doing is replacing stuff that's depleted elsewhere. So China's got that dependency, and we do too, right? And so what happens when there's only 70 million barrels or 60 million barrels, right? Well, that's a problem for the big tech network state too. You know why? Because their entire income stream is on discretionary spending. In other words, it depends on a global mass, hundreds of millions of consumers who have discretionary income to spend on all that junk that then they can advertise, on Facebook and Google and sell through Amazon. So once there's no more discretionary income to blow on frivolities, and there's only essentials, how much profit is there for Facebook and Google in selling toilet paper?
Yeah,
Not very much.
I disagree, and here's why. When the pandemic hit, it was interesting to see who was still advertising, right? Like in the first month of the pandemic, when there was that real kind of shock to the system, when consumption dropped off, when activity dropped off, it was, fascinating to me as a media researcher who was still buying ads. The biggest buyer of ads was governments, right? Like governments are always huge users of advertising, right? After governments, it was big business. Because big business, even if they're not selling you something, they still want your attention. They still want to make sure that their brands and their message are still visible to you. So I agree, Charles, that if you take away, the amount of money that people spend on junk, you're hurting the margin of the digital companies, absolutely. But their technologies of persuasion, their infrastructure of surveillance, their mechanisms of social containment will be even more valuable the worse the economy gets and the more volatile society becomes. And, just as every new media eats the media before it, right? How television, the first content on television was just plays on stages, right? They literally set up a television camera in the back of the theater to shoot the stage, right? The same way that so much of internet content today is taken from media that came before it. The network state will eat the nation state, and in so doing have as its customers state and provincial and municipal governments who will use Facebook as a way to communicate directly to the public. Use Amazon in place of a postal service, in place of a public service delivery. So, I agree with you, Charles, that there are finite resources, finite energy, and that the real conflicts will be over those scarce resources and who gets to use those scarce resources. But I think, contrary to hurting the digital giants, it will help them because they will be the cartels in charge of attention. They will be the cartels who control the social and identity infrastructure that all of society operates on top of that. Unless, as per Mark's dream, we gravitate towards open source distributed protocols that allow for these communications to exist without these intermediaries, right? Without these data warehouses that store all this information between us and our governments or us and our whatever. So, I agree with the broader economic analysis of we are entering very dire and economic times in which polarization is the norm. But I disagree with the political analysis that the people who are powerful today are probably going to get more powerful unless your name is the U.S. government, right? Unless your name is, the Canadian government, because these are the guys who seem asleep at the switch. But if your name's Amazon, if your name's Facebook, if your name's the Chinese Politburo, yeah, I tragically think your future's kind of bright.
Yeah, you could be pretty bang on there. And I mean, I totally, to Charles's point, we haven't even begun to feel a contraction in energy inputs anywhere in the world, really. Except if we do, it's through some sort of temporary natural disaster, but we haven't really begun to feel like even what 1 million less barrels a day is going to feel like. And then if it's 2 million and then it's 3 million. And the reality is, doesn't matter what your political ideology is, a society's prosperity is dependent on the per capita energy usage. When the per capita energy usage goes up, a society becomes more, I'll put even prosperous in double quotes, right? You have more of a, that's where wealth effects come from, is energy input. And I think we are the elephant in the room that nobody really talks about as we're heading into a world where the energy per capita is going down. I mean, sometimes the conspiratorial minded person in me who fears that the Great Reset is just a big bamboozle to enact a global dictatorship isn't being impelled by the financial system coming unglued, although that's part of it. It's kind of this realization is that we're going to have a lot less energy to go around, and we need everybody in the developed world to ratchet down their energy consumption. And they're not going to do it willingly. They have to be, there has to be a reason for them to do it. That's the conspiracy, that's with the tinfoil hat on. The tinfoil hat off is just, that's kind of the reality that we haven't really felt yet. But I think we're on a runway that we're running out of very rapidly. And within the next 5 to 10 years, we're gonna notice that, and it's really gonna change a lot of these dynamics, or not change them. It's gonna accelerate them. It's gonna amplify them.
One of my readers turned me on to one of the first ecological systems writer. I think his name was Howard Odum, Odum. And he posited that humans are sort of hardwired for maximizing consumption, what he's called power, in other words, in terms of energy. So if we'll just strip the tree, right? We find a tree full of ripe fruit, we're going to strip it right to the bone and then move on, maximize it, maximize consumption. He said what we can do is maximize efficiency, but that's going to require like a rational, kind of a plan. But I think that's part of degrowth. Is there's a lot of behavioral things that can reduce power consumption, right? We all know, but it's just power. Like water's been cheap, so cheap that it's okay to waste it. So once it becomes costly, then people will change behaviors, and you can save a lot of electricity just by only using electricity when it's being generated intermittently, right? Like the solar panels are firing up, okay, then everybody can use a little more power, and then when it's at night, you cut your power consumption to the bone. But I think you're right, Mark, and I want to go back to this idea of what kind of change or structural change, per Jesse's essay, what can happen, and or the inevitability of it. And part of, I guess, to me, the dividing thing is what strategist Edward Lutock said between force and power. Force is when you've got the jackboots on the ground and you've got 100,000 people staring at little cameras of the streets, and all this enforcement, right, is very expensive. And so if you're having less energy, then the government share is also going to decline, or it's going to destroy its economy if the government is using all the available energy for surveillance and enforcement. So the Luttwak's point was power is more like the power to persuade. In other words, if you can convince people to go along with your regulations and your control, on their own, right? Because it somehow they decide it benefits them, then the enforcement costs are minimal. And of course, that's really what Jesse is speaking about here about the network state, is that if big tech can persuade us to do whatever the central authorities want us to do, and we'll do it of our own volition, then that's a really cheap form of power, you know? So then it becomes, well, how addicted are we to social media? That raises that question in my mind.
I don't think that's the right frame. I don't think social media is about addiction. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about persuasion and coercion, right? Addiction implies some kind of pleasure, right? Addiction implies that we're getting something out of it. And I understand how addiction plays a role. Like, I get the way in which this technology is engineered to, use dopamine, and I understand how attention is used to sort of fuel similar neurochemical impulses. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here when we talk about the power of persuasion of the network state. We're talking about both an engagement with the collective psyche, an engagement with the collective unconsciousness, and the power that the news media used to have to shape the narrative, right? To, as Mark has legitimately complained, to decide what is in bounds and what's out of bounds when it comes to what is appropriate conversation and what is not.
You talk about it in past tense, though. You don't think?
Well, I talk about it in past tense.
It's more forceful today than it ever was.
Yeah, I wasn't. That's not what I was referring to. I meant past tense as in encouraging any jerk who's watching us right now to go and watch past episodes by referencing the brilliance you have shared in past episodes. That was the past tense that I was talking about, not the past tense as in it's no longer your concern. But nonetheless,
no, I didn't mean it that way, but go on.
And indirectly validating your perspective, what I'm suggesting here is that the medium is the message, right? The power that these platforms have is not our addiction to them. The power they have is the public utility they play in our society, right? The social infrastructure that they play in our society. That is not an individual's decision. That's not one person saying, well, I am not going to use Facebook, and that makes me a moral person, right? No, for me as... using Facebook is not about individual choice. It's about the power that company plays in our society. If there was an alternative to Facebook that as a society we could choose that was based on decentralized protocols, of course, yes, I would endorse that. I would use that. But that too is not an individual choice, right? These are social choices. These are collective choices. And that's why I reject the idea that it's about addiction and instead say it's about power. It's about power. It's about infrastructure. That's why Zuckerberg started in Harvard, started in the Ivy Leagues, was backed by In-Q-Tel, was backed by Peter Thiel, was backed by the people he was backed. It's a power play. And I think that if we put the emphasis on the individual, we put the responsibility on the individual, then we miss the power that is at work, and we miss the power that is necessary to oppose it, if not replace it. And I think that's the whole point of why we emphasize protocols and decentralized approaches rather than centralized authoritarian ones.
That's a very good point. And I made some notes about that it's a power structure, not just individual's choice or struggling with an addiction. Very well said.
Go ahead,
Agreed.
Mark.
And sorry, and I didn't mean that. I guess I interrupted, but I didn't mean to. When I talked about the past, I thought you were framing it like the media had this power in the past and doesn't have that power anymore. That's what kind of perked me up there, because I see the dynamic. Yeah, but that isn't what you were saying in retrospect, because I get more terrified every day at the power of the media, that they just pick up a idea or a meme and they declare it to be true, and 90% of the population is going to believe it to be true just because they saw it on CNN, and Facebook and Twitter won't let you see anything else, right?
And I'm the opposite. I am I feel that the power that the media has always had, to your point, is increasingly laid bare in a very ugly kind of emperor is naked kind of way. And where you suggest that 90% believe it, I disagree. I think that number is way less and falling. And I
hope
feel
so.
that my point is that the power of the media, as we have historically seen it, is every day more and more irrelevant. What is relevant is the power of the network. And in the power of the network, it really doesn't matter what you believe. You can piss in the wind all you want, and your post will be ignored. You'll be shadow banned, right? Like, people will just downvote you on Hacker News or Reddit or wherever it is you want to say what you got to say. So, the power of the media, I think we're focusing on precisely because it's in the past, because it is less and less relevant. I understand that it bothers you legitimately, but I think what's more bothersome is the fact that you have the freedom to say that the media is wrong, and that amounts to nothing, right? That doesn't actually change the public narrative. That
Right.
you have the ability to dissent, and lots of other people have the ability to say, we object to the media's narrative, and their objection amounts to nothing. Because that is the power of the network, that the network can marginalize you automatically and put you out of bounds so that your voices don't count. And you don't even know that it's doing that, right? You're like, how come I'm not getting any likes anymore? How come I'm not getting any comments anymore? Because the whole point of shadow banning is that you don't know that you've been shadow banned. That's the hypocrisy of algorithmic justice, that not only do you not get a hearing, but you don't even know you've been sentenced unless you've actually been executed and knocked off the platform. So, that's where I push back on the whole power of the media, because I think we need to talk about the power of the network to literally disappear people in plain sight, right? To have people who are on the platform thinking that they're participating on the platform, when in reality they've been shadow banned, so no one can hear or see them, and yet they're still talking.
Yeah, it's like
Oh, go ahead, Mark.
one quick thing, Charles. So it's like the media can come up with the most unreal, absurd narratives, and that unto itself wouldn't be as dangerous if it weren't for the rails of the narrative machine, which is big tech right now, and the networks, to say, we are greasing the rails for this narrative, and everything else is just getting sinkholed into oblivion. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that somebody on another podcast, the host asked me, have Americans lost the ability or the will to resist tyranny? And I said, well, I think the repression, the tools of repression that Jesse just described are actually a lot more severe and harsh than they were generations ago. Like 2 generations ago, if you wanted to protest the status quo, you might get thumped, by the police if you were in a protest that turned violent, or that was, you'd get tear gassed or something like that. But outside of an actual physical confrontation, you were still fairly safe, unless you were Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist or something like that. That there was, of course, there was a lot of targeted infiltration and so on by the security forces. But now it's like, well, yeah, it's very easy to have somebody doxxed or shadow banned. And I've been shadow banned myself. And if I didn't have my own private server that I could look at the records, I wouldn't even know, right? To Jesse's point, most people don't pay for their own servers, so they don't have any way to really track their traffic and where it's coming from or where it's not coming from anymore.
Which is, not to get off topic, and feel free to argue against what I'm about to say from any direction you might wish. But this is why I find the rights, or the American conservative objection to social media, so absurd. That to me, it's like the house is on fire and they're yelling about the termites, right? And I understand that there is a grievance at play, which is absolutely legitimate. But I feel that the way in which they're articulating that grievance guarantees that it won't be taken seriously and distracts from what the real issue is, which is something that I think is not partisan at all, which is the power these networks have is unaccountable. It's arbitrary. It's tyrannical. And that if instead of the rights articulating this in defamatory partisan terms, if they were instead to articulate this in terms that, Mark, I think you just did. Like, I think the way you articulated it was close, right? And you do it as a libertarian. You do it as somebody who's like, look, I don't really have a side in this. You know, I'm trying to understand the big picture. And so I think that's why you came close when you talked about the rails, right? That here you have these companies who, you know, to change your language slightly, who are tipping the scales of justice for the people they like and burying everybody else, right? That if you present it in non-ideological terms, if you present it in a kind of methodology that here's the methods that this network state is using to govern itself, all of a sudden it's not left versus right anymore. Like, all of a sudden it's everyone going, oh yeah, like that's not fair. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. You know, that's definitely wrong. And that's why I get so frustrated when the right frames this in the sense of like, we're being treated unfairly, but the other side isn't. When instead they should step back and realize everybody's being treated unfairly and everybody's getting screwed by this system. The fact that you might be the one who is benefiting from the scales tipping in your behavior, that's only true for one part of the day. The other part of the day, if it was truly transparent, you'd realize that you are getting screwed. That's how the system works. And I think if we were to articulate it that way, instead of putting it in the ideological way that Americans in particular are so prone to do, I think we would collectively be able to recognize that these platforms are behaving in ways that are unacceptable to everybody.
Well, I took to following the, I'm going to get the name wrong, but I think it's the World Socialist News Network or something on Twitter. And they're on the other side of the spectrum, but they're outside the Overton window on the other side of the spectrum. So I'm watching them complaining about shadow banning and having their YouTube videos taken down and stuff like that. And they're not the only ones. I started noticing it around the new year, right? That it's like, you know what? So the Overton window on the right side is like, there is no right side. And then on the left side, it's like, okay, you can go this far, but no further. And it's, you know, take that for what you will. It's I was curious, but then you did fill it out. I was curious, like, what did you mean when you said how the conservatives object to it? But then you kind of you padded that out a bit. So
yeah, we didn't really get into the monetary inflation topic. We'll have to do that in the next salon. But that's important too. Yeah, we got the supply chain
you touched
inflation.
upon it, Charles. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you touched upon, or you alluded to the psychological effect, which I think is a big driver of it, right? That once people sort of believe that something is happening, it happens, right? And I think inflation has that effect. We've talked about in the past the spigot of money, and it's not just the closer you are to it, the more you benefit. But Charles, you've talked about people living outside of their means, and I think there is a real temptation, and I see it where I live in terms of farmers who real estate is going up in value, right? Capital is available at really low interest rates, so they've got this very valuable asset all of a sudden that they're sitting on, and so they use it to buy more equipment. They use it to engage in more projects. If it works out, great. But it's very easy for it to not work out. And that's where you start to get the cascading failures. And I think we touched upon that today. Yes, we should definitely touch upon that in the future. But I think it's the psychology of all of it that drives it. And I think that is something that we sort of touched upon once again.
Yeah, well, good. That's an excellent summary.
when the bubble's expanding, everybody can feel rich. But as soon as the bubble starts, as soon as the pie contracts, it's knives out.
And so
Did I mention
here,
that?
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to
No,
say,
no.
Easy DNS started taking Dogecoin on Friday night. So
That
saw
says it
that.
all.
I know. The top tick on Doge. No, but
we did ring the bell. It's been down ever since.
but in the spirit of our tradition of introducing a topic that we leave everyone tantalizingly hanging on, I do want to go back to Jesse's comment from a couple salons ago about what is real wealth. And so when we talk about inflation and assets being worth a lot of money financially, but Jesse's point was there's other forms of wealth, and we really need to talk about that because we're wealthy, but it's like in beyond financial measures, which is what the obsession is in our society and economy.
Livestock. Heads of goats.
Ammo.
Cow. Yeah. It's true. It's true. These are the things people value.
And community and skill sets and people caring about you. All of those things are forms of wealth that you can't buy.
If you circulate in the parts of TikTok that I do, it's lumber. It's your lumber supplies.
I've heard this a number of times.
You're a rich man.
Recently, yeah, that lumber is really going through the roof.
Oh, you haven't taken a look at lumber futures? You gotta go take. I've been freaking people out. I'm like, go take a look at the lumber futures graph and translate that into the rest of the economy. When you think about how we use wood for not just our houses, but lots of stuff, and maybe that right there is a good point to end.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess that was Axis of Easy. We think it was episode 42, the answer to the life, the universe, and everything. Like us on YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes. I'm Mark Jeftovic with Jesse Hirsch and Charles Hugh Smith. We'll see you next time.